concepts for this topic, and they are all the different types of behaviours within social influence. So you could be asked to define these, you could be asked to pick them out of a scenario. So the first one is conformity. This is yielding to group pressure, so going along with a group to fit in with that group. And there's various different reasons why you might do that, which is normative and informational social influence that we'll talk about later. And then we've got collective behaviour and crowd behaviour. So collective behaviour is where the behaviour of two or more people behave collectively, although you probably don't want to use that word when you define it. So what it means is they're working together for a particular purpose. So, for example, they might be volunteering at a soup kitchen together to help the homeless. So those people wouldn't be in that kind of group normally, but they've come together to do something usually pro-social. It could be like I was going to say a protest, but actually, the crowd behaviour, this is where you come together for a common purpose or for a riot, for a protest, for a music concert, for a football match, for a gig. So, the difference between these two, because they're quite similar, is that crowd behaviour is where you go to a particular place and then the people that are there doing that thing, so for example, a football match or a gig, become then a crowd. Whereas for a collective behaviour, you're actually doing something that has got some kind of like positive outcomes, like you're doing like a behaviour rather than just being there, if that makes sense. And then we've got antisocial and pro-social behaviour. So antisocial behaviour is those behaviours that go against social norms and harm society in some kind of way. So like assaulting other people, graffitiing, vandalism, shouting loudly. Whereas pro-social behaviour is behaviour that is in line with social norms. You behave in these ways to be a good person, so it benefits society in some kind of way. So, for example, being kind to others, being considerate, basically the opposite of antisocial behaviour, being helpful. And then finally, we've got obedience. So this is where you have an authority figure and you are following orders or not following orders from that authority figure if you're being obviously disobedient. And then the first theory that you need to know about in social influence is situational factors causing our behaviour. And you could say, just to help you get your head around this, that it is on the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate, although situational, dispositional are slightly different to the nature-nurture debate, but we'll clarify that as we go through. So, mentioned these briefly before. So, with majority influence and conformity, you've got two different types. So, majority influence is when the majority agree on one particular thing and the minority might kind of go along with that majority or might not for these various reasons. So for example, you might go along with the group to be liked, which is normative conformity, and then you might go along with the group because you think that they're correct and they're right and that maybe they know something more than you do, so you might just go along with it because you think, oh, they probably know it and I don't really know it, so you kind of go along with it in that way. And the example study that we learned about was Ash's study. So it was the lines that you can see on the slide. There was a target line, and they were asked to match that with the three options. And they were like in a group, and all of the group were Confederates. They were in on the study, and there was only one naive participant who wasn't in on it, who was the real participant, and they sat second to last in the group. So group sizes of about, I think they were like 6+. Um, and the Confederates gave an obviously wrong answer. So this line here that they're matching up, it goes with C. So for example, they give an obviously wrong answer like A, so they'd all say A, A, A. Then when it got to the naive participant, they'd see whether or not they'd go along with what everybody else said. And they found that 33% of the time they gave answers to fit in with the group. And actually, it was much higher when they looked at whether they conformed once, it was about 75%. But on all trials, it was 33%. So, quite a lot of people going along with what the group are saying because they either want to be accepted by that group and fit in, or because they think that the group knows more than they do. And then we've got collective and crowd behaviour, and they've put these two together because obviously they're very similar. And the suggestion is that when you are in a crowd or a group doing something together, that you act under a common social identity. So you have what's called an in-group and you're part of that in group. So, for example, if you go to a football match, the team that you support, say you support Man U, they're your in group. And if Man U are playing Liverpool, they'd be the out group. So you would be against Liverpool. So you kind of pro-social to your group and anti-social to the other group. What also can happen in groups like crowds and during collective behaviour is de-individuation. And this is where you lose a sense of identity because you behave like the group, you take on the kind of group's identity, and you don't really think through like the consequences of your behaviour. You kind of just go along with the group and you don't really think that there's anything that would happen to you negatively because of how you're behaving. And this happens more when you feel that kind of sense of anonymity. So you don't think that you're going to be recognisable in that group. So you do things like riots and stuff like that, which you probably wouldn't do if you were on your own. And then we've got another situational factor. So all these that we're talking about so far as situational factors is culture. So if you're in a collectivist culture like China, Kenya, places that value the group more than the individual, Japan is another one, you're more likely to be pro-social and help others because you're interested in harmony in a group. So you want to like be nice to other people. Whereas if you are in an individualistic culture like the UK, like Australia, like the USA, like places in Europe, you are more about yourself, more about finding your own happiness and doing what's right for you. And your kind of family, for example, or your group kind of maybe comes secondary to that. And so you're more likely to be antisocial. And they've got like a study which showed that Kenyan children collectivist culture were more altruistic. So altruistic, it means helpful, so pro-social behaviour than American children. So 100% were for Kenyan children, only 8% for American. And this study was about helping with chores at home and things like that, helping care for younger siblings. So Kenyan children just did it without even thinking about it because they wanted to help the family, whereas American children were more likely to say no, that they didn't want to do those kind of things or maybe not follow through on the chores. And they've also found a correlation between inequality, so people being richer than others, and antisocial behaviour. So if you are in a poor area, you're more likely to be antisocial and behave in that way. And then obedience is another situational factor. So Milgram did the study on obedience, which was about giving electric shocks to a learner. So there's teacher and learner, they're in separate rooms. So Mr. Wallace was the learner, and he was strapped up to the shock generator. And Jack Williams was the guy in the lab coat that was telling the teacher, which was the naive participant, the person that wasn't in on the study, because obviously Mr. Wallace was a Confederate, to shock Mr. Wallace every time he got an answer wrong. So they were doing word pairs like blue girl, green grass, and they gave them like, once they'd learned them, they gave them like 4 options to pick from to say which was the right one. And if they got it wrong, then Mr. Wallace would get electric shock. And they went up to 450 volts on the shock generator. So 65% of people obeyed all the way up to 450 volts. 100% of them obeyed up to 300 volts. And obviously, that could kill somebody because out of a socket, 240 volts. So just somebody wearing a lab coat telling somebody to do an instruction meant that they could potentially have killed somebody. There's a really good documentary called The Push by Darren Brown that shows that this actually happens today. So you might, think that it wouldn't happen still, but it does. And also, charismatic leaders are supposed to have a real impact on people obeying. There's loads of kind of examples of. There's a guy in Jonestown in America who would like led a cult and like recruited all these people, and then at the end got them all to kill themselves because he was a charismatic leader. Charismatic means kind of like likable and funny, and you want to like be like them. So they're more likely to make people obey them, basically. And the suggestion from the theory of the situational factor is that when we're on our own, we're in an autonomous state. So we make our own decisions, we think about the consequences. Whereas when there's an authority figure, we act as an agent for them and we follow their orders. And because we're following what they say, we think that the consequences should go to the authority figure rather than us. And so therefore we're more likely to do immoral things and, potentially kill people. And this is what explained Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And some criticisms of these situational factors is that the theory is quite deterministic. It suggests that, anybody who is from a pro-social, anyone from a collectivist culture is going to be pro-social. Anybody from a individualistic culture is going to be antisocial. Or the one we've got on here is anybody would conform in that situation, or anybody would obey as an authority figure. And actually, we're all different. And quite a lot of people in the Milgram study, for example, disobeyed and didn't go along. Those 35% of participants refused to go up to 450 volts. So clearly there must be some free will to choose your own behaviour. It's not as straightforward as saying, oh, well, just because of those situational factors in place, that means that people would obey. Theory is also very reductionist. It's not really considering any individual differences because, again, people are different. Some people may be more likely to conform than others. Some of the dispositional factors that we'll look at in a minute are saying that you're more likely to conform if you've got low self-esteem. So clearly there's some individual differences, and therefore this situational explanation might be less valid, less accurate at explaining why people are affected in terms of the key concepts. And the study that supports this idea of situational factors is Bickman, and the situational factor that they were investigating was uniform and the impact that that would have on obedience. And the prediction was that if you were wearing a security guard uniform, you were more likely to obey someone with a milkman and more likely to obey someone with their own clothes on, so that's civilian. So the sample was 153 adult pedestrians just walking down the street in New York, aged approximately between 18 and 61. And it was an opportunity sample, so they were available at the time. They just went up to them and asked them to do various things. Because it's on the streets of New York, it's a natural setting. So we've got a field experiment and we're manipulating the IV because we've got Confederates dressed up in different uniforms. And they've done it on a weekday afternoon. And we've got an independent measures, so they only ask somebody in either of the uniforms, not all of them. So we've got some issues there with kind of like individual differences, it's not the same person, things like that. And they're measuring whether or not they obey the commands. Those Confederates that were in the uniforms, there was 4 white males, bit of an issue because, maybe if they were of different ethnicities or different genders, that would have had an impact on obedience. But they're all kind of similar in terms of age and their build, and they act in the same way. And they also don't know what the aim is, so it's not like they can show, demand characteristics in that way, or researcher bias is probably more appropriate. And the 3 things that they were asked to do, they were either to ask to pick up a bag of litter, put a dime in a meter, or stand on the opposite side of a bus stop. So they're getting gradually more strong in the request, because like to pick up a bag of litter is not really an inconvenience, but to stand on the opposite side of the bus stop where you might miss your bus, that's more of an inconvenience. So they did a gradated level of requests. And then the findings show that the guards obeyed significantly more than the milkman and the civilian. So we can see the percentages in the graph on the slide. You don't need to know the specific percentages. You can say like the guard was 3 times more likely to be obeyed than the civilian. That's enough to put in. And then experiment 2, so we've got in this one a field experiment again on the streets of New York, quite similar to the first one. The only difference is they've got a smaller sample, so they've got 48 adult participants, age this time approximately 46. We've still got independent measures, but they've changed it this time. So they've got either a civilian or a security guard. They've not bothered with a milkman this time. And this time they're interested in the IV, so a second IV, of whether or not there's surveillance. So the authority figure either stood with the person that they asked the command to, or by a car at a distance. Oh, sorry, that was the first one, or they walked away. So in the first condition, they are being watched by that kind of person in the uniform, and in the second one, they're not being watched. And they were trying to see whether or not that would have an impact, because you would assume that maybe if they're being watched, they'd be more likely to do it. But actually, it didn't have any impact. Surveillance had no impact on whether they did the task or not. And the task in this one was to put a dime in a meter, so it wasn't the other 2. It was just that one in that experiment. And then Bickman also did some questionnaires. So there was 2 questionnaires. The first one was on 141 students, whereas the second one was on 189. And the first one was asking them to look at 29 scenarios. So, for example, a scenario of standing on the opposite side of the bus stop, or putting a dime in a meter, or picking up a bag. So those are some examples of scenarios. And they were asking them, do they think that the security guard was more legitimate than the milkman and the civilian? And the questionnaire said they didn't think that the uniform made any difference. They thought that they were, neither of them were going to be obeyed, which shows, based on the results from the first experiment, that people don't really know how they're going to behave, because actually, in the first experiment, they did perceive the guard as more legitimate because they obeyed them more. On the second questionnaire, they asked them to predict how people would behave in general to experiment one. So would they obey the guard more than the milkman, more than the civilian? And again, they didn't think that the guard had any more social power than the milkman or the civilian. And so they didn't think there was going to be any differences. But obviously there were. So again, showing that people are not very good at predicting how people will obey. So the conclusion of all these studies is that wearing a uniform does give you more social power, it does influence other people's behaviour, and it's a situational factor that would make people obey more. So we've got some support and some evidence for those situational factors. And for some evaluation, very ecologically valid study, we're in a natural environment on the streets of New York. It's how they would actually obey in real life. So that's very good. They're probably not going to be affected by demand characteristics because they don't know that they're not a real authority figure. But then this makes it unethical because they've been deceived, they've been lied to, they don't know that this person's not really an authority figure. And they might feel quite embarrassed about that if they realise. And also, we've got a lot of cultural bias because we're in New York, not representative of everybody. Maybe people's obedience is different in other places, particularly in other countries. New York's individualistic culture, that could be interacting as well. So it's lacking population validity for that reason. And theory two, dispositional factors. Some of these are nature, the odd one is nurture, which I'll talk you through. So these are factors about an individual, for example, internal factors like the personality, brain structure, things like that. Whereas the situational ones are about the environment. So very different, contrasting theories. The first dispositional factor, or one of the dispositional factors, is self-esteem. So believing in yourself, liking yourself. People that have higher self-esteem are less likely to conform, less likely to go along with the group, which you would imagine would be the case, because you're more likely to kind of think, well, maybe I know better if you like yourself. Whereas if you've got low self-esteem, you're less likely to go. Sorry, if you've got low self-esteem, you're more likely to go along with everybody else and conform because you kind of like want to be liked by them. You're a bit more bothered about that. And so you kind of do what they're doing, regardless of what you perhaps think about it. Another dispositional factor is morality. So morality is knowing what's right and wrong. And so the researcher Kohlberg came up with a theory of different stages of why you might do the right thing. And the first stage is you obey because you fear punishment. The second stage is that you obey because you want some rewards. The third stage is that you obey because, sorry, I don't know why I'm saying obey. I kind of mean like you're doing the right thing, you're being good, because you want to be a good girl or a good boy. You want to be seen as being good in society. Stage four is about because it's the law. Stage five is because it's democratically agreed on, everyone agrees that that's the right thing to do in society. And then stage six is that you have your own version of ethics. So you kind of decide for yourself whether or not you think it's the right thing to do. And usually it's that you believe everybody deserves the right to life and things like that. Now, what we're interested in is where are you more antisocial? So Kohlberg would suggest that you're more antisocial in stage two, which is the one for trying to get rewards. Because if you want a reward, you might then be antisocial to somebody else to get that reward. And so therefore you're more likely to be antisocial in that stage. Whereas in stage, all the other stages, you're probably going to be pro-social because you want to, well, particularly the first one about avoiding punishment, you'd be pro-social to do that. And to be a good girl and a good boy in stage three, you'd want to be pro-social. To follow the law, you'd be pro-social. You might not be pro-social in stage six, where you've got universal ethics because you're deciding for yourself. But again, usually it's because you want to have like universal human rights for people and be nice to everyone. So actually, you probably would be quite pro-social in there. So the only stage where you're kind of going to be antisocial is that stage two. Well, that's what this dispositional factor suggests. And then there's brain differences. Now, this is a separate dispositional factor, but it does link to the first two that we've just mentioned. So there's been a positive correlation between self-esteem and grey matter in the hippocampus. So there's been low grey matter volume, and they do ask about volume, so make sure you remember that, in the hippocampus if you've got low self-esteem. So the idea is that if you have reduced grey matter in the hippocampus, it affects your self-esteem, and then that makes you more likely to conform and go along with everybody else. And then for the next brain difference, it was the prefrontal cortex. If you damage your prefrontal cortex, you've got faulty moral reasoning, so you're less likely to be pro-social, more likely to be antisocial. And this explains kind of like psychopaths and why they might be deciding what they're deciding because they have a damaged prefrontal cortex. And then we've got authoritarian personality. This is the one which is more like a nurture kind of one, which is why it doesn't fully fit with the nurture debate, because authoritarian personalities where you blindly obey authority, you don't question it, you just do whatever they ask you to do. And you discriminate against those people that you see as inferior to you. So you like very antisocial to people that are inferior. And you view things very black and white. And you will be, you'll highly conform to like, in fact, I don't know if very conformist is the right word. You're more likely to obey, but you're probably not going to go along with a group unless you see them as being like valued. Whereas if you see someone as a group being inferior to you, you wouldn't kind of conform. So it depends on the group. And the reason why it's a bit more nurturing is because it's due to strict parenting. So the idea is that because you've been very harshly disciplined as a child, so that's what creates the obedience to authority figures, but you're very like salty about that, you're very bitter about that, and so because you can't be horrible and antisocial to your parent because there's consequences, you instead displace that onto an inferior group, and that's why you're horrible towards an inferior group, because it's the hatred that you felt for your parent at being harshly punished is being put onto them instead. And then we've also got the last one, locus of control. So this is the idea that we've either got an internal locus of control or we've got an external locus of control. So people with an internal locus of control believe that they have control over their lives, over their decisions. Any success or failure that happens in their life, they think it's due to them and their choices. And so therefore they're more likely to join in with collective behaviour because they think they can make a difference because they're confident in themselves. They're also less likely to conform and obey because they question things more. And they can be antisocial if they believe that they can change things, but they wouldn't be antisocial where they go along with the group. Whereas if you've got an external locus of control, you don't believe you have any control. You think everything is someone else's fault. So if something like you fail a test, for example, you'll blame like the person that made the test, or you'll blame the teacher rather than blaming yourself, which is what internal locus of control would do. You also think that your success, any like things that you do good, are due to luck, so you don't even have confidence in yourself really. And so if you've got an external locus of control, you're easily influenced by others. You're more likely to be antisocial because the group is being antisocial. More likely to not join in with collective behaviour. Like you're more likely to sit back and just not join in with it because you think, what's the point? It won't make a difference anyway, because everything is due to chance and luck. And then a criticism of these dispositional factors is that they are quite reductionist. They ignore the situational explanation, so you can use the other theory as kind of a contrast. So it's quite limited, so it doesn't explain like the impact of uniform or anything like that. Also, a lot of the research is quite biased because it's on Western culture. So Kohlberg's research, for example, it's on American boys, so it's not really applicable to other cultures. So it's difficult to kind of generalize that. And there's also a suggestion that locus of control might change dependent on the situation, and so therefore it's not consistent. You might not you might be internal locus of control in one situation but external in another, and so therefore that can't be you know the only explanation, and also it makes it quite difficult to predict behaviour, and then any interventions that you put in place, any practical applications, might not be very effective then. And then there's another one here that says dispositional explanations suggest that behaviour such as well-being is fixed and cannot be changed, but actually situational factors like your parents and your upbringing and your culture might actually have an impact on how you change in different situations, and so therefore maybe dispositional are not great. That one's a bit of a wishy-washy one. The other three are probably a little bit better. You've got to be careful though with this one, because if the question doesn't mention locus of control, you obviously can't then use that as an evaluation. So the kind of first two are a little bit more generic. Locus of control is a little bit more specific. And then the piece of research which supports this is Moral, which is the NatCen, all about the riots in Tottenham in 2011. And they're interested to find out, why are people getting involved in the riots? Is it because of situational and dispositional explanations or not? And we've only got 36 people in the sample. They're over and under 18. So we've got lots of different ages, lots of different ethnicities and work status and gender, and most are in education. So we've got diversity in that sense. We've got an interview, and they're actually in group interviews. And they happen 5 weeks after the riot. So you might say maybe they've forgotten what's actually happened 5 weeks later. Um, they've given informed consent. They know exactly what they're participating in. It's all confidential. They've been kind of assured that they're not going to tell the police on them if they admit that they rioted and looted, which is quite important because otherwise they might not tell the truth. And yeah, they're interviewed individually, but also in groups. So in the groups, they might like play up in front of the group, or they might show social desirability bias, try and look good, and say that they didn't loot and they didn't riot. So those kind of things might be playing a part in the study. And the reason why the riots took place is because of Mark Duggan. So he got shot by police. Police thought he had a weapon. They didn't. Sorry, he didn't. And so they had a peaceful protest at first outside the police station, and then because um, the police were not really responding in a positive way, then it kind of went into bottles being thrown, cars set alight, and there was obviously there were officers were attacked, the shops were kind of broken into. And what they found from the interviews were that there was different groups of people that took part in the riots, and they took part for different reasons. So for example, we had the Watchers that were present but they weren't involved. So these were either bystanders that were just walking through, they're happy to live in the area, or the people that were curious and chose to be there. We've got the rioters, which were the ones that were violent and antisocial. So we've got protesters upset about Mark Duggan. We've got the retaliators trying to get back at the system. So, for example, there was a lot of kind of like poverty at the time and low job opportunities. A lot of youth centres have been closed down. And so people were really mad at the government for that, because they didn't feel like they had any hope. So they were the retaliators. We also had the thrill seekers that were doing it for the excitement and the buzz. And then we've got looters, which were stealing from the shops. And these were either just opportunists, they saw an opportunity to steal and thought, yeah, get some free goods, or actually people that purposely were trying to do it to sell later on and maximize profits, make some money from it. And then we had the non-involved. So these are the people that either chose to stay away, they didn't want to be involved at all, or there was people that wanted to be there but weren't because they didn't know it was going on. And then they also found that there were some nudge and tug factors. So nudge factors were things that would have encouraged them to take part in the riots, and tug factors were the ones that would have kind of encouraged them not to take part in the riots. So, for example, if they had any previous criminal records, um, or they had a job and they were doing quite well, that would have tugged them away from taking part in the riots. Whereas if they felt like there was no hope and, they didn't like authority or they'd had bad experience with the police, that would have been kind of like a nudge factor to take part in the riots. And these were either situational or dispositional factors, so they found a mixture of both. Um, and so, in conclusion, antisocial behaviour is influenced by collective group behaviour, like conforming to the group that was, taking part, and also dispositional factors, like whether the individual thought that it was right or wrong to take part. And they were kind of like, making a kind of cost benefit analysis while, they were deciding whether they took part in it or not. Like, kind of lots of factors kind of went into whether they were antisocial. So a lot more complicated than what some of the theories are suggesting. And some evaluation for this, very ecologically valid. It's a real event, so it's like the natural behaviour. They did actually take part in the riots. We've got a mix of genders, so we've got no gender bias. That's very representative. However, not very reliable memories because it was 5 weeks later. We've got retrospective data, past data, and actually they might have spoken to other people or seen it in the media, and that might have affected their actual memories. And then obviously we might also have social desirability bias because it's an interview. They might want to make themselves look good and say that they didn't take part in the riots and looting, or maybe they would have changed and kind of actually made themselves like look like they might have shown off a bit maybe, or trying to please the research with demand characteristics. You can also mention that as well. And then finally, we've got applications. So this is a real world application of the social influence topic. And this is how to change people's attitudes. So, for example, you can use minority influence. This is where you've got a small minority of people that are trying to change the opinion of other people. And you can do this if you are consistent and you say the same message every time. If you're committed to there's some kind of personal loss, and if you're quite persuasive, and if you've got someone who's quite charismatic, they can kind of be quite persuasive. And there's an example of this one. So the Heads Together campaign by the Royals, at the time, it wasn't accepted that mental illness was the same as physical illness and that you could talk to people and get help. Whereas Prince Harry shared his personal experiences with depression after losing his mother, Princess Diana, and feeling like grief from that, and he got depressed after that. He took quite a cost to him because at the time it wasn't accepted. So, the newspapers might have kind of criticised him and things. So he was very committed. He's also very consistent at saying, you know, mental health is as important as physical health. It's the same, and everyone experiences at some point. So they were very consistent with the message. And because they're royals and they're influential and people know them and it's kind of celebrities, and they also in the ad campaign had footballers, so they were trying to, put other persuasive people in there. They kind of, all those kind of things change people's opinions of mental illness. So this was around 2016, I think it was, that this was happening, that they brought this campaign out. And the idea is that we have the snowball effect. So over time, more and more people agree with this minority, and it leads to you becoming the majority. And then the final people can be influenced by majority influence. And we learn about the Time to Change national campaign, which we also looked at in the psychological problems topic. And they also had things like time to talk days in schools and workplaces. And the idea is that now the majority of people believe about mental illness that it's the same as physical illness. It's important to talk about it and share, get support from your friends and your family. But there's a few people that don't really agree, and it's kind of bringing them on board with majority influence. And maybe it might happen through informational influence. So, for example, informational conformity, where people might think, oh, maybe they know something that I don't, and usually that then brings them on board. Or even normative conformity, where you might want to be liked by the majority of people, and you don't want to be seen to be being negative towards people, and so you might go along with it. And so, if you got a question about majority influence or minority influence, you would have to perhaps mention that you do a campaign like Heads Together or like Time to Change, and that would help kind of reduce stigma and discrimination. So, stigma is negative views, and discrimination is treating people differently. So, that would reduce that. And then you could give some examples of how. So, if it's minority influence, you can put consistent, committed, persuasive. And if it is majority influence, you could talk more about these kind of like things, like the time to talk, or you could talk about the snowball effect or something like that. So I hope that was helpful. There's also a Blockit that you can play if you follow this link. Um, and there's some exam questions and mark schemes that are on Teams, so you can use those to see if you understand like how to answer them all. And if not, you can always rewatch this video to look back at it.